Now, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the publication of one of Australia's best-known children's books. The Magic Pudding by Norman Lindsay came out back in 1918, and it's never been out of print. Joining me now is the Executive Director of the Plain English Foundation, Neil James. Neil, welcome to the program.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, there are not a lot of books anywhere in the world really that have enjoyed this much favour and this sort of record of publication for a whole century.
Yeah, in children's books often tend to date. They tend to be connected with their era. But for a children's book, in any language, any country, to last 100 years is doing extremely well.
And to go overseas as well. Tell us about the life of this book. How has it come to be so emblematic of its time, of Australia, and to endure for this long?
I think at the base of it, its success is that it's just plain fun, and that was a deliberate part of what Lindsay wanted to do. He said to the publisher when he was doing it that he had an anti-sentiment sentiment. He didn't want a lot of children's books at the time were very sentimental, or they had to be didactic and have a message and a purpose. And he just wanted something that was going to be fun and that would appeal to kids. And he thought the main thing that would appeal to kids is a story about food.
Which is not something one of his best friends actually agreed with, because the thought at the time, as you say, was that kids like fairies, they don't really care about food. Norman Lindsay had quite a different view about that.
Yeah, in fact, the whole book came about as a result of a bet. He was having a chat with Bert Stevens, who was a literary editor at the time, and Stevens said, "Oh, you know, I think fairies are the subject matter that kids would prefer to read about," and Norman said, "No, it would be more about food." And when the publisher, George Robertson of Angus and Robertson, heard about that, he said, "If you can persuade Lindsay to write a book on it, you're on a fiver."
How is it that it hasn't dated then from 1918 when this was written?
I think two reasons. One is the quality of the artwork. I mean, one of the other distinctive things about this is that Lindsay was the author, but also the illustrator. And so this was the era where the first author and illustrator successes were happening. May Gibbs was the other example at that time with Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. And Lindsay was one of the greatest artists in Australia in his own right, in etchings, in watercolour, in oils, in line drawing. And so the characterisation, the sophistication of those drawings, I think is one of the reasons it lasts, because the line drawings capture character and capture emotion at a much greater level of sophistication than you get in a lot of children's books. But apart from that, it's just a rollicking good story. It doesn't have a serious purpose that's tied to its time. It's a story about a group of friends who go on a journey to try and protect a pudding. A
talking pudding.
A talking pudding. So there's the fun, and it's a never-ending pudding. You know, his name is Albert, but he's the cut and come again pudding, which means that you can take a slice and eat it, and the pudding recreates.
Regenerates itself, and if you want to change the flavour, you whistle and you turn it around a couple of times, and it's a plum pudding all of a sudden.
And so they go on a journey, and the only real plot to it is that there's a pair of rascally pudding stealers that are constantly trying to get hold of the pudding. And so it's simply a series of episodes where they meet a lot of characters and battle with the pudding thieves. There's not a lot to it in plot. And in a sense, that's one reason why it's lasted, because it wasn't tied to anything overt of its day.
At the same time, this was written in the second half of the First World War, 1917 to 1918, a very tragic and confronting time for so many Australians. How is it that such a whimsical story came to be told at such a difficult time for Australia and Australians?
I think there's a personal aspect to that with Lindsay. His own brother was killed at the Somme, and during the war he'd been doing a lot of work drawing propaganda posters, a lot of the famous posters of Lindsay to encourage young men to enlist, the whole conscription debate was happening. He was committed to the war, but obviously he and his family felt the loss deeply of his brother.
And he depicted the brutality of war in his drawings as well. He didn't sort of shy away from it and glamorise it in any way.
Yeah, well, he wasn't an anti-sentiment. He absolutely hated the idea of sentimentality and wanted to be reflecting the world as it really was and coming to terms with it as it was. So I suspect a large part of it was him. It was a bit of an antidote. It was towards the back end of the war. He'd be doing a lot of those posters. He'd be doing a lot of political cartoons. He was the chief cartoonist for the Bulletin at the time, and so I think this was a way of relaxing, for somebody who was a workaholic and had so many different interests. I mean, drawing these whimsical characters and creating a fictional world around it was probably a bit of a relief.
He was sort of a controversial character at the time because he also drew nudes, sirens, political cartoons. Not a natural progression necessarily for someone to then move into children's literature.
No, but you see, he had many facets to his artwork. He did a lot of commercial ads, and the very early characters that turned up in the Magic Pudding were often in ads he was drawing for boot polish and cocoa.
So likenesses of Bunyip Bluegum turned up in all sorts of ads before Bunyip Bluegum even existed.
Yeah, it really was about a 10-year development of these characters, and not just the central character, the koala, but there are other characters, chickens and dogs and possums and so on. And he'd been developing these over about a decade in journals such as The Lone Hand, in the Bulletin. He had a couple of books called the Norman Lindsay book, number 1 and 2. So he'd drawn these as cartoons, as well as doing the more serious oil paintings, the pen drawings, the nudes, as you say. He built model ships. I mean, there was virtually no sort of element of the arts he didn't have a go at. He was a master etcher. It was one facet of the broad range of art that he did.
Tell me about his personal life. He was unconventional in that regard as well. He had a muse with whom he lived with as his wife, and they had 2 children. They never married. What was his personal life like, and how did that progress over the time that these books became a raging success?
Well, in fact, his personal life wasn't as... I think it was more unconventional by reputation than reality. It's true that he had some sons by his first marriage. He married very early, and then that marriage started to fall apart. And so he took up, as you say, with the woman who was his model. He did actually marry her the week before their first child was born. So, but they lived up in Springwood in the Blue Mountains in the west of Sydney. There was all sorts of rumours about the bacchanalian parties that went on up there, but for the most part, really, he had a studio, he was away from the hustle and bustle, and he was just there working.
It's interesting that the book may not have actually taken off, may not have been such a critical part of Australian children's literature, Australian literature broadly, had it not been discounted soon after it was released. When the book was released, it sold for 21 shillings and sixpence, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. And people said, great book, but far too expensive for mere children's literature.
And in fact, Norman was unhappy about the price. You know, it was a guinea book, I mean, slightly more than £1, which was the equivalent of a high-quality art book.
So in terms of cost, what's that in today's money?
Oh, it's well over $100, depending on how you calculate it by relative buying power or by inflation. But it's an expensive book. Today, that would be the equivalent of a high-quality art book, full-colour art book. But in a sense, the publisher was being very canny because the publisher knew that there would be a market there for the people who were interested in his art, who would buy it as a kind of a limited edition, first edition. So they printed 3,000 copies, but they only bound 1,200 of them in this lavish format. and they sold out very quickly. They sold out really by the end of the year. There was only a couple hundred left. But then sales tapered off, and so with the other sheets that they had already printed, they rebound them in a smaller format and then drop the price by 2/3.
Yes.
And
so
that,
from 21 shillings down to 7 shillings, which is a big discount.
It's a huge discount, but not uncommon. I mean, that drop was certainly larger than normal, but it was not uncommon for, and similar to what we see today with a book published as a hardback in cloth, and then it's re-released as a paperback, and there's a big drop in cost. So, not dissimilar to some practices that happen today, but yeah, certainly a bigger drop than normal.
Norman Lindsay died in 1969. He lived long enough to see this become incredibly popular, to be republished over and over again, to become a theatre show. What did he think about the trajectory that this book, this story took, and how it was developed by publishers?
It depended, I think, on the day and on the edition that came out when you asked him. Some of the editions that came out he absolutely detested. There was one that came out in the UK, for example, where they got some jobbing artist to redraw it, and he absolutely hated it, refused it, to allow it to be sold in Australia. So there were some that he disliked. He was, because the original production values were such that the drawings could only be done in black and white, except for the cover. You know, the original colour was in colour, but otherwise it was black and white. So as production became more sophisticated and colour printing became more available, he did come back. He did some extra drawings. He did a new cover for it. He did some tinting of some of the illustrations to add a bit more colour. So it was one of those books where he continued to have a hand in its production. He had a very close relationship with the publishers over the years, and I think that was part of the reason it continued, because he gave it a refresh every now and then. And when the first puppet show, the theatre show, was first conceived, they had a problem because they didn't know what colour all the characters' clothing was. So they came to Norman Lindsay and he said, "Oh, okay, I'll draw some colour pictures." So he drew a whole lot of new pictures in colour, which they used to create the marionettes for the puppet show. So he had that ongoing relationship, and I think that refresh was one of the reasons it kept up its place in Australian consciousness.
And for a great artist in his own right, he will forever be associated with these books. Neil James, it's great to talk to you. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.